World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with the season finale of our World Affairs Roundup. Before they head off for summer holiday making, our penetrating panel of world watchers are here to explore 3 destinations likely to capture their attention between weenie roasts and trip to the fishing hole. Slathered in sunscreen with iced tea in hand are John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back once again to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for the nice festive glasses.
Well, I'm going to start my summer holiday making, I think, with our show today and turn most of the hard work over to each of you. You'll give us a presentation on the area that you're going to keep an eye on this summer. So, John, if we would, let's start with you.
All right. Well, I wish I could offer you a rosy prognosis of what's going to be happening in Europe that would fit with the introduction that you just offered us. What do we know about what's going on in Europe? Well, right now, through a combination of props from mostly Germany, some France, and the IMF, Greece is struggling along. At the back of the problem is the issue of the euro, the currency of the Eurozone countries of the European Union. There are 16 of these countries. They're mostly the larger countries. There are 27 European Union countries in total. The problem comes from the way in which Greece got into the Eurozone. Apparently, they either fudged a bit on their application, or the European watchdogs in Brussels were not thorough enough in terms of checking what was going on. And so Greece has been a kind of a weak child to the Eurozone for a number of years. Now with the economic downturn, this has turned rather ugly. The unhappiness in Greece is not just about the fact that they're being held up to another standard. This gets into the politics and the culture of Greece in terms of what expectations they have and how the government is supposed to be delivering on a range of kinds of issues. Normally, when the banking sector gets in trouble, the government is there to bail them out. Well, in the case of Greece, both the banking sector, the private banking sector, and the government are in trouble. There is an issue called sovereign debt, and Greece is the poster child for that issue in the world right now. Even if the Greeks do everything right, if they make the kinds of cuts that are necessary, that when it comes to this fall, the late summer, early fall, they have a number of other obligations that are coming due that will require probably going back to the EU, back to the Eurozone grouping, and to the IMF for more help. The unhappiness is not just in Greece. There is significant unhappiness in Germany about Germany's requirement to pull them out of this mess. But at the bottom of it, Germany is helping Greece not because they feel so compassionate towards the Greeks, but basically they're concerned about the European Union and they're concerned about their own economic stability. The French are also involved in this. And each of these countries are now playing, especially Germany, is playing a number of cards which will get them much greater authority, responsibility within the Eurozone and within the European Union as a result. France's President Sarkozy was elected in 2007, and on a platform of reform. Well, he has been not able to put through much of that reform because of the unions. Now he's running this up again. He is calling for a constitutional amendment to push the reform through, and guess what? There's strikes that are being called for in France right now. Let's assume that Greece is successful in weathering this storm. There is still Portugal, Spain, Ireland, and Italy in the background. Each of these countries have different economic and structural conditions, and this is going to have an important influence on the global economy as we go through the summer. Now, how does this affect us? Well, instability in Europe affects markets. Markets just do not like to have that kind of unstable situation. And the other issue, I think, is that if we get to the point where one of these other countries becomes a flashpoint, if several of them become a flashpoint at the same time, this could really throw the globalization process into a turmoil. There's Liquad Ahmad wrote a wonderful book called The Lords of Finance. I highly recommend it to our viewers. And what he did is he charted the careers of the 4 central bankers at the time of the Great Depression. And what I found in reading his book is that we weren't talking about a V in those days. We weren't talking even about a W in terms of recovery. We were talking about going up and down a roller coaster. And there were several ups and downs when the central bankers and the governments felt that things had changed, we had passed, turned the corner, things were going along just nicely. As we go through the summer, Europe is facing, obviously, economic issues, but they're also facing some very serious questions about who is going to be part of the Eurozone, what is going to be the state of the European Union, and these are questions that are going to rebound on us as well.
Well, do you see any possibility of people leaving the Eurozone?
Yes. Lots of people who are looking at this. No one's saying that these things will happen, but there is a possibility. France threatened to leave the Eurozone if Germany hadn't come in to help with Greece. So there are economic conditions that apply, there are political positions that are applying, and there's also the psychology of people who are afraid.
Well.
My turn?
Sure.
I am looking at Russia's foreign policy to consider whether or not we're actually witnessing some kind of fundamental change, not fundamental change, but real change in the direction to more cooperation with the West. There's a map that shows the geography for those of you who need a refresher geography course, because what's happening in Russia, the future of Russia depends greatly on its relations with the Central Asian countries, the 5 Central Asian countries, as well as the Eastern European countries that were part of the Soviet Union before it broke up in 1990. And just very briefly, from the period about 2003 to 2008, Russia was pursuing initially under President Putin, a foreign policy that was reasserting regional dominance, seen as trying to move away from the West. Putin gave a speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference in which he said that Russia had to reassert itself in the world, that we needed to have a new multipolar world, and mostly it was seen as Russia reasserting itself and trying to claim parity with the United States and the European Union. And of course, the great example of this type of policy was the intervention in Georgia. Although it was provoked, the war in Georgia was sort of a classic example of this. But since then, there have been a number of indicators of some kind of change. And most recently, the participation of the United States and NATO, including troops from the United States, the UK, and Poland in the Victory Day parade in Moscow. And also the rapprochement with Poland. which has been a serious thorn particularly in Russia's relations with the rest of the EU countries. And there isn't time here to go into the tragedy, the plane crash and all, but that certainly is part of this. And so there's some indicators of real change. And I should also add the U.S.-Russian nuclear arms agreement to replace the START Accord, Russian assistance in Afghanistan, and possible assistance on the sanctions against Iran, which are being negotiated now. But what's driving all of this, and it's really a pragmatic foreign policy, is Russia's really dire financial situation. And here, there are close links actually to what John was talking about with Greece. Different origins, but they tie together. Russia is now has to borrow money. It had large reserves that it has gone through. Its GDP has fallen tremendously. It has tremendous structural problems at home. And it's in a position now where you've got two factions, well, there are more than two, but different sides in Russia. One is arguing for the economic status quo based on a commodity market, state intervention, the old resource-based economy, versus those under Medvedev who are saying we need to pursue a new foreign policy that is based on modernization, and we will pursue deals with anybody who helps us raise our standard of living. There's no commitment to changing anything internally in Russia's domestic politics, but in fact, it's really interesting because it sounds a lot like China's we'll change our economy, but we're not going to change our political structure internally. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays itself out. One analysis said that if oil prices stay below $80 a barrel, and today I noticed that they were around 70, then this will be pushing for the modernization track. If they go above 80, it gives all the impetus to those who want to pursue the economic status quo. So that's what I'll be looking at.
So in about the minute we have left before our break, how has the Obama administration managed that relationship so far in your view?
Well, when the Obama administration came in, there was a famous where they went to Moscow and said they were going to reset their relations, and there's faux pas there, but that's another story. And they have been working with the Russians rather successfully of late. One of the things in order for the Russians to modernize their economy, they need to depend heavily on the European Union. So that's where this John's story comes in. There's an opportunity here for the U.S. We don't actually have, in terms of their overall percentage, that much trade with Russia, and we have very little foreign direct investment there. So there is an opportunity, but if the European economy goes down and the Russian economy goes down with it, there aren't going to be many opportunities anywhere. We'll all be suffering.
Well, Robert, thank you very much, Ann. We'll give you your moment in the sun after our break. For our viewers, we'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup, where we're looking at stories our panelists will be watching over the summer. So, Robert, tell us what's going to occupy your attention.
Well, I'm going to be looking at the new British coalition government. I think on our last episode of the Roundup, we talked about the election and how neither party got a majority and what the implications were. Well, since then, we now, in May, got a coalition government, the first coalition government in Britain since Churchill's war cabinet. And so just to remind viewers, the Labour Party, which had held power for quite a good deal of time, had been discredited, both with the economy, both with the very unpopular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then also a scandal around expenditures by members of parliament on things such as their vacation houses with public money, kind of a little like the House Bank scandal in the early 90s, if viewers remember that, in the United States. And so Labour did not do very well at all, and Gordon Brown is out of office. And but no no party was able to get a majority. They had the first presidential debates in the history of British politics, copying the United States for a change, since we copied them for a couple centuries. And what happened is a third party candidate burst onto the scene, not unlike Perot did in this country in 1992. Nick Clegg from the Liberal Democrats, who used to be the second or first party, one of the two parties in Britain back in the 19th century, haven't actually held power since the 1920s, since David Lloyd George did, an adversary of Woodrow Wilson in this country, who helped negotiate the League of Nations. But the Liberal Democrats stayed around. So imagine in the United States that the Whig Party had not gone away after the Civil War, but remained as a minority party and then suddenly rose back. But they did not win, but they prevented the Conservatives or Tories from getting a majority. And so what was ultimately developed was a coalition government between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. And there's a real question, since we haven't had one of these in Britain in a long time, and Britain is not, unlike other parliamentary systems, used to a coalition government, whether this government could even survive or whether the ideological principles of the two parties are even compatible. And so far, what has happened is fascinating in that they've come out with a unified program in which they combine many of the principles of both parties. So they have the emphasis on personal responsibility and on fiscal conservatism that the Conservative Party stresses in British politics, but also some of the more libertarian ideas and also ideas about human rights that and election reform that the Liberal Democrats have championed. The Liberal Democrats, it's hard to characterize in American terms that some of their elements are somewhat libertarian, like, say, the Perot movement was in the United States, but also environmentalism, a peace party, so kind of a strange combination of what you would call at least liberal in this country, but liberals, kind of suburban liberals, I would say, and combinations of kind of conservative libertarian ideas. And so they've tried to meld these. They came out with a statement of principles over the weekend, a program that fits together in some ways. And what's interesting is that what's going to really test the government is that the Liberal Democrats have now signed off on the conservative idea that they need to have massive cuts in spending. They have a large deficit. It's about 11% of GDP, but to give you an example, the U.S. has 10.6% of GDP, so it's not a whole lot larger than ours is, but they are going to make massive cuts. They've announced £6 billion this year. They're making more announcements this week, and then ultimately they're going to have a review commission that will come out in the autumn with a 3-year plan. But we're talking about cuts where they might cut 300 to 700,000 public sector jobs in order to try to reduce the deficit. But at the same time, this is going to cause incredible stress and strain. There's going to be massive protest against this, most likely. It's going to dent a lot of different constituencies, and so it's hard to know whether a coalition government can survive through all of that, and it's hard to know whether that makes economic sense. What Nick Clegg came out over the weekend saying was that when they campaigned against massive cuts during the campaign, he said that if you did cuts now, you'd threaten and jeopardize the fragile recovery. He's now saying we didn't know how bad it was in the Eurozone, harkening back to John's topic, and now that we've seen that, we need to take more drastic action right away, which is right in line with the Tories. Whether the Liberal Democrats will lose votes in the future by siding with a lot of these principles are not in line with their voters is questionable, but there's also huge stresses on the Conservative coalition. The backbench Tories, and backbenchers are the ones who are not in leadership. They invented the term, but we have them in this country as well, are outraged. They're outraged that the Liberal Democrats got too much in terms of the coalition deal. They're outraged that the statement of principles and the program of the coalition government supporting the human rights conventions of Europe, which they despise, quite frankly, and have a nationalist reaction against, and suggests engagement with the Eurozone, which is also anthem to conservatives. And so there's a lot of, they're trying to control their backbenchers and prevent them from going into open rebellion, and in fact had to use a lot of election mechanics just to set up the current structure of government. They were concerned about losing some early votes within the party. And so it's a fascinating situation. What one former British Prime Minister said about what blows up governments, ultimately, and this was Harold Macmillan, it was, events, my boy, events. In other words, we don't know what other events are going to occur in all of this, but the idea, the consensus somehow, that they should make these deep cuts in spending and in public services it's a game that may lead to labor coming back in a new form and taking power within a few years. But in addition, it may actually, I think, undermine economic recovery if you have that much of a cut in people's income. I mean, the government and government investments are a crucial part of the economy in the United States and in Great Britain, and so the run towards fiscal austerity, as it could in this country, could cause, as it did in 1936 in the United States, another dip into depression and recession, and costs a lot more money than it saves. And so I think it's interesting to see whether what will happen with this coalition, but they're taking on, if they actually have the courage to move forward with this level of cuts, something that is bold and also very precarious and potentially damaging, I would say, to the economy.
So, are there any common threads running through all three of these stories, particularly with regard to American foreign policy?
Well, we're talking about what Britain is doing right now in terms of the economic cutbacks to reflect the world situation, which certainly is happening in Europe. The question in Russia is more interesting because I also saw it from a slightly different perspective. Yes, Russia has gone through a severe cutback in terms of its economic activity, but at the same time, Putin was able to use this to be able to exercise greater control over more sectors of the economy and to rein in those oligarchs who had remained a little bit removed from his power. So Russia's a little bit different. If the price of oil continues to be below, say, $80 a barrel, that hurts all of the oil producers. And that takes away and it eats into that reserve that Russia has had, about $500 billion.
It's gone.
I don't know. You know that it's all gone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're starting to borrow. So it's
then it becomes much more serious.
And they've had to borrow money from the Chinese, and a lot of money from the Chinese. And the map on Central Asia that I didn't put that I didn't really talk about is there's a lot going on where China is now stepping into that area, and they're turning down loans from Russia because China's offering much more favorable deals to them, so they're looking east. So.
I just want to know, though, as we start to wrap this up, has the image been portrayed yet?
We have not. No. As a reference to Robert, I think you've got a preferred model for the British government. I think we've got a graphic here.
I believe this came from the Institute.
And I just want to know if his mother knows about this evolution in his lifestyle.
So I've been accused of being a monarchist now. This is George III for the viewers, with a different face than George III actually had. Wow. Well, they said, one of the things that some are arguing about the British elections is it has Britain moving out of the 19th century and away from a direct vote for parties and towards a candidate-centered and a regional-centered election. And that's partly why you ended up having a hung parliament. So, this is good to reflect back to the 18th and 19th century.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left. Certainly there are probably other stories we should keep an eye on over the long summer months. Robert, maybe to start with you. What else might you be keeping your eyes on?
Well, I think we should be, since we just had a little diplomatic dust-up with Mexican President Calderon's visit to the United States, looking at the flare-up over immigration in a single American state, Arizona, trying to enforce immigration laws and obviously both greatly offending our neighbor to the south, but also revving up the troops on the right in this country. So I think that should be watched closely and will play out over the summer.
Thailand. I mean, right now there is somewhat of a ceasefire, but underlying the confrontation in Bangkok and throughout the country is a class warfare, is severe differences between the haves and have-nots that just won't be pushed away and will have to be addressed as we go into the summer.
Elections in Kyrgyzstan, they're coming up after the unrest, the deposing of the ouster of the former president, and it'll be interesting to see if they're able to. There are 14 opposition parties, 14 opposition groupings, and it's going to be very interesting to see whether they're able to do anything other than what they've done in the past, which is sort of they're proposing a parliamentary system, and it'd be difficult to see that happening, actually. On a good note, one of the themes of this story is it might be a good time for Americans to go to Europe if they can get there with the volcanic ash. But
We'll see.
But I don't mean to.
That's more in line with our summer theme.
I wanted to end on our summer theme.
Well, and once again, you know,
Museum.
in terms of American foreign policy, is there any direction all of this suggests the administration should be going?
I see it's hard for the administration to take on more fires when they have to deal with the Afghanistan-Iraq situation. That just, not only is it a consumptor of time, but it's also money. And so in order to be able to go and do other things, it's much more, you know, you have to have the money.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. To our panel, thank you for a season of quality punditry. Thank you to our crew who put these things together. And thank you to our viewers for being with us. We'll see you next fall with more International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,